In 2007, the quiet Czech town of Kurim became the setting for one of Europe's strangest investigations. It started with a simple baby monitor. A neighbor switched it on expecting to see her own child asleep. Instead, the screen showed a young boy she didn't recognize. He was alone, frightened, locked in a small room. When police traced the signal to a nearby house, they uncovered a hidden world, a real-world nightmare of deception and control. Behind the front door lived a mother named Klara Morova, her sister Katrina, and a mysterious woman who claimed to be a 12-year-old girl. The truth about that girl and about what happened inside that house would soon shock the entire country. Investigators found something that reached far beyond one family. It touched upon secret rituals, psychological manipulation, and an obsession with spiritual purity that some might call a modern-day cult. I'm John Genua. This is America's Strangest History. This is the Kurim case. It's a story of how an ordinary Czech suburb became the center of a mystery that the world was never supposed to see. What made the Kurim case so haunting wasn't how it ended so much as how it began. In May 2007, a woman living in the town of Kurim turned her baby monitor on to check on her son. Instead of seeing her own child, the video feed showed a boy, naked from the waist up, locked in a small, dimly lit room. His face was bruised. He looked terrified. The woman thought it must have been a mistake, hopefully just a strange technical glitch. The more she watched, the more obvious became that this wasn't an accident. Someone nearby was using the same wireless frequency. She called the police. Within hours, investigators were scanning houses in the neighborhood to try to find the source of the transmission. The signal traced back to a quiet two-story home on Bryanska Street, specifically to the home of Klara Morova, a 31-year-old single mother of two. When officers arrived, Klara was calm and cooperative. She said there must be some kind of misunderstanding. But when police entered the house, they found a locked cellar door sealed with tape and heavy chains. Inside was the boy from the video, Andre, Klara's 8-year-old son. He was malnourished, shivering, covered in marks that told a story no child should have to tell. As officers searched further, they discovered something even stranger. A second child, Jakub, Klara's older son, he was in the house as well. He appeared terrified of his mother and refused to speak at first. Police later said that the boys were kept in a small, soundproof chamber. They were beaten, cut, sometimes forced to stand for hours in freezing water. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery wasn't the abuse itself, it was who else was living there. A teenage girl named Anna was found hiding inside the house. Klara introduced her as a 13-year-old that she'd taken in from an orphanage. There was something about Anna that didn't fit. Her behavior, her voice, even the way she spoke to Klara, it wasn't like a child at all. Investigators soon realized that Anna wasn't a child. She was a 33-year-old woman named Barbora Škrlová, and her connection to the Morova family was far darker than anybody could have imagined. What followed would unravel a story involving psychological control, religious manipulation, and the alleged influence of a secret group known as the Grail movement. It's a group whose teachings blurred the line between spiritual purity and total obedience. When news of the Kurim case broke, the public's attention immediately turned to one question. Who was Barbora Škrlová? Police learned she'd been living with Klara and her sister Katrina Morova for months, pretending to be a young teenage girl. She shaved her head, she dressed in children's clothing, she even enrolled in a local school under a false identity. Teachers described her as a quiet, anxious, yet strangely manipulative. She called Klara mom. No one could explain how she managed to deceive so many people for so long. Investigators soon discovered that Barbora was not just part of the household, she was its center. She had woven a complex web of psychological control over Klara and Katrina. She managed to convince them that she was divinely chosen, that their family had a sacred purpose. At the heart of this belief was a fringe sect known as the Grail movement. The group claimed spiritual descent from a German mystic named Oskar Ernst Bernhardt. He wrote a series of texts in the early 20th century about achieving purity through suffering and total devotion. While the Grail movement was not officially recognized as violent, its Czech offshoots had taken the teachings to extremes. Followers believed that humanity was divided into pure and impure, and that pain could cleanse the soul. Some called it spiritual purification. Others called it obsession. Barbora was deeply involved in that network. She often spoke of tests and rituals, separating the worthy from the unworthy. In her distorted vision of these beliefs, Clara's sons became subjects of those tests. It wasn't only faith, it was control. Barbora convinced Clara that the boy's suffering was necessary for their salvation, that God, or something claiming to speak for him, was guiding them. Evidence later revealed that Barbora had used a series of psychological manipulations that resembled coercive cult conditioning. She isolated Clara from outside influence, introduced spiritual messages. She claimed to act as an intermediary for higher powers. But investigators found another layer beneath the spiritual language. There was a fascination with what some described as a cult practice. Inside the Morova home were notes referencing ritual fasting and purification through pain. Investigators found symbols associated with esoteric Christianity and older European mysticism. According to testimony, Barbora would perform ceremonies at night, claiming to channel divine guidance. Now, witnesses said she altered between soft, childlike persona and then something colder, authoritative, almost priest-like. The Grail movement itself denied any direct connection to her or the crimes that took place, but former members confirmed that their fringe cults existed. There were small private groups using the movement's teachings in ways that blurred into fanaticism. For Clara and Katrina, those ideas became their reality. They believed they were chosen to purify the children's souls, even if it meant breaking their bodies. When the truth of what happened in the house came out, Barbora disappeared. Where she went, how she escaped, how she managed to reinvent herself again, was almost as bizarre as the crimes themselves. As Czech investigators built their case against Clara and Katrina, one figure was still missing: Barbora Škrlová, the woman who passed herself as a 12-year-old girl named Anna. She's vanished. When officers went to question her, they found her room empty. Clothes were gone, along with her identity papers. Within days, she slipped out of the country entirely. For several weeks, nobody knew where she was. Then, in early 2008, news broke from Norway. Police in the town of Oslo discovered a frightened teenage boy wandering the streets who called himself Adam. He claimed to be 13. Said he was an orphan from the Czech Republic who ran away from an abusive family. At first, Norwegian authorities believed him. The boy was quiet, polite. He seemed traumatized. He was placed in child protective custody and even enrolled in a local school. Now, it took weeks before anybody realized that Adam was not a boy at all. In fact, he was the same woman at the center of the Kurim scandal. Got that? The revelation stunned both countries. How did an adult woman, already a national headline in the Czech Republic, manage to cross borders, change gender, and then fool a bunch of experienced social workers? Investigators later learned that Barbora had help from members of the same spiritual circle connected to the Morova family. Now, using false documents and sympathetic contacts, she reinvented herself completely. When Norwegian police confirmed her identity through fingerprints, she was extradited back to the Czech Republic. Reporters surrounded her at the airport as she arrived under heavy guard. Cameras captured a small woman in a baseball cap hiding her face, escorted past the flashing lights. During questioning, Barbora offered few answers. She claimed she fled because she feared for her life. She insisted she was a victim of the Morovas, not their leader. But investigators already gathered testimony suggesting she actually orchestrated much of what happened in the Kurim house. Her return transformed the case from a local horror story into an international obsession. In Czech headlines, she became the woman who played a child. To the public, she was kind of a living symbol of how far deception could go. Even as she sat in custody, investigators were still uncovering evidence that the abuse was not just the product of one disturbed household. It appeared connected to a network of believers, people who spoke of prophecy, purification, and the secret trials of faith. It was that network, more than anything else, that convinced prosecutors that they were dealing with more than just a family crime. It was something approaching a modern cult. As the investigation widened, detectives realized that the Kurim case couldn't be explained by just one family alone. Every path led back to a reclusive man named Josef Škrla. He was Barbora's father, a quiet figure who, on paper, had nothing to do with the crimes. But according to the witness statements, his ideas shaped nearly everything that happened. Škrla was a teacher and a self-styled spiritual mentor who was a big fan of the Grail movement. He drew from their writings, a religious philosophy that blended Christianity with mysticism. In his private circle, these teachings were transformed into something rigid and authoritarian. Followers believed that the modern world was corrupted and that only a few chosen would reach spiritual purity. Members met in small apartments or secluded cottages. They studied passages from the Grail texts and discovered ways to cleanse the soul through obedience and discipline. Now, over time, Škrlova's group began calling itself the Family of Light. It's a title that implied divine mission and moral superiority. Former members later told journalists that Škrlova's vision of faith revolved around the idea of testing. Pain, deprivation, and humiliation were ways to burn away weakness. In his words, the flesh was temporary, but the soul could be refined through suffering. This ideology spread to the Morova home. Barbora, raised under her father's influence, repeated these same phrases to Klara and Katrina. She convinced them that their children carried impurities that needed to be driven out. Investigators later found handwritten notes linking Škrlova's group to the Morovas. Some of those notes outlined some pretty scary stuff. Ritual fasts, confessions, acts of correction. Others mentioned a coming judgment day that only the purified would survive. While no evidence proved that Škrlova ordered the abuse directly, prosecutors still argued that his ideology provided the justification for it. He disappeared soon after Barbora's arrest, and he managed to avoid the media entirely. To this day, his exact role is unclear. What is clear is that the beliefs circulating in that circle weren't random acts of cruelty. They followed a distorted logic of salvation. The Grail movement itself condemned the violence, and they denied any link to Škrlova's sect. But experts in new religious movements later described his teachings as a closed system of thought. Once a member accepted the idea that pain equaled purity, there was no way out. Psychologists who studied the case called it a classic example of coercive persuasion. That's fancy talk for a structure that combines isolation, fear, and selective kindness to erase personal judgment. Now, in that environment, obedience becomes salvation and doubt becomes sin. For Klara and Katrina, that system collapsed when the police broke down the door. For the Czech Republic, it raised a different question. Just how many other small groups like this could exist? It's not a pleasant thought. The Kurim case was no longer just a family tragedy. It became a national warning about the thin line between faith and fanaticism. When the case finally went to trial in 2008, the Czech Republic stopped and watched. Courtrooms in the city of Brno were packed with reporters, lawyers, curious people. The story was more than just a criminal case. It was a national obsession. The defendants sat together. Klara Morova, his sister Katrina, and Barbora Škrlová. Each looked different from the photographs that were circulating in the public. Klara looked pale, withdrawn. Katrina rarely spoke. Barbora, the woman who once passed as a child, seemed detached, almost unbothered. Over the next several months, the court heard hours of testimony from investigators, psychologists, and medical experts, also witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. I mean, we got physical injuries, recordings, written notes documenting the punishment rituals. Prosecutors described a system of control fueled by distorted faith and psychological dependence. Klara, they argued, believed that she was following divine instruction. Barbora and Katrina convinced her that the suffering of her sons was necessary for their spiritual purification. When asked directly why she allowed it to happen, Klara wept and said, "I thought I was helping them." Barbora's defense insisted that she had been a victim as well. She was manipulated by her father and drawn into the Morovas' delusions. But her long record of deception, like her false identities, her months as Anna and then later as Adam in Norway, that left the court unconvinced. In June 2008, the verdict was read. Klara received 9 years in prison, Katrina 10, Barbora 5. Now, 3 other associates connected to the extended circle were also convicted. Seems kind of light, right? The sentences sparked debate across the country. Some said they were too lenient for what the children were forced to endure. Others argued that the case was as much about mental manipulation as it was about violence, and that no sentence could undo what had already been done. How could an educated mother come to believe that harming her own children was holy? How could a woman disguise herself as a young child so completely that no one saw through her disguise? Seriously. And how many people around them suspected something but said nothing? In the months that followed, the Czech parliament called for a review of child protection laws. Schools and social workers began cross-checking identity records more closely. The Ministry of Education tightened procedures for verifying backgrounds of both students and guardians. In the aftermath of the trial, investigators, theologians, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, Everybody struggled to describe what actually happened in that house. The evidence showed physical cruelty, but something deeper drove it. Some shared belief system that fused religion, ritual, and obsession. Experts later called it spiritual delusion shaped by occult thinking. Not the kind of occultism tied to dark ceremonies. This is quieter. It's a more insidious form that begins with personal revelation. The idea that one person hears divine truth that nobody else can question. At its core, the small circle around Yosef and Barbora became what psychologists call a closed cognitive system. Every event, every doubt was reinterpreted into the same framework. In this case, suffering meant purification, obedience meant faith. But that's not enough, because dissent meant evil. Over time, their spiritual vocabulary shifted. The words trial, cleansing, and sacrifice appeared in notebooks seized from Marova's home. Drawings combined Christian symbols with older imagery, circles and flames, geometric patterns that specialists later linked to folk mysticism common in Central Europe. To be clear, these elements didn't belong to any formal occult order. Instead, they reflected a homemade theology built by borrowed fragments, part scripture, part folklore, throw in some psychological control. During police interviews, Katrina described nights when Barbora performed what she called cleansing sessions. Candles were lit, prayers were spoken in a mixture of Latin phrases and made-up words. She said Barbora's voice would change, sometimes soft and maternal, other times commanding, like a preacher addressing a congregation. Investigators interpreted these rituals as acts of domination. These were tools to reinforce authority and fear. The occult symbolism gave the abuse a spiritual justification. Punishment turned into liturgy. The Kurim case wasn't only about violence, it was about the human need for meaning. After the verdict, Czech scholars studying new religious movements warned that similar belief clusters actually exist today. There are definitely small, isolated groups interpreting religious texts through their own perspective. They may not call themselves cults, but they share the same ingredients. The Kurim case forced a reckoning. In the years after the trial, both boys, Andrei and Jakub, were placed under state protection. Their identities were sealed by the courts, and their location remains confidential. As for Clara and Katrina, they served their sentences quietly. After her release, Clara disappeared from public life. Her lawyer told reporters she wanted to rebuild her relationship with her son someday, but the courts never confirmed if that was allowed. Barbora also kept to herself after prison. She avoided interviews and refused all offers for books or television deals. Her father, Yosef, never resurfaced publicly. Some believe he moved overseas. Others think he went underground. Journalists visiting years later found that residents were still reluctant to speak about it. They said that for months after the story broke, photographers and film crews swarmed the streets. The place was mobbed with strangers driving through town just to see the house. The building was eventually sold. The new owners renovated it. They painted it white. They changed the number on the gate. Locals say that people still slow down when they pass, so it's not completely forgotten. In the years since, other small sects in the region have disbanded or even restructured as an effort to distance themselves from any comparison to the Kurim case. The Grail movement itself continues to operate legally, but under closer scrutiny. It's very careful to separate its teachings from what the media called the cult of purification. I think a real unsettling factor here was that this wasn't a movement of hundreds. It was a rather small circle of like 5 or 6 people. A mother, a sister, a friend, all under the spell of a woman who convinced them that she carried some divine truth. Tragically horrifying case. I'm John Genua. You've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.